Over the last 1 week, India has been alarmed by a spate of viral infections in this part of the world.
5 years after the world grappled with COVID-19, China is once again battling a new health concern, a surge in human metapneumovirus or HMPV.
I hate to say this, but it feels like 2020 all over again. Overflowing hospitals and thousands of patients with flu-like symptoms.
A post from the X handle SARS-CoV-2 stated that China had declared a state of emergency. However, there has been no official confirmation on this.
We can tell you that India has 3 confirmed cases. All 3 are infants. 2 cases were detected in Bengaluru. The third was found in Ahmedabad.
Should Indians be alarmed by the HMPV virus?
Well, should we? For that, we need to understand what it is. The human metapneumovirus or HMPV is a common respiratory virus that causes lower and upper respiratory infections. It typically results in a cough, fever, blocked nose, and shortness of breath. Is it a new virus? No. It's been around for years, in fact, since you and I were children. And trust me, that's a long time ago. Actually, 5 to 10% of all respiratory infections are caused by this virus during the winter season. Who is at risk? Very young people, elderly people, and/or people with heart or lung-related comorbidities. Is it like COVID-19? No, it is not. The difference is that we have all likely been exposed to this virus before, unlike COVID-19, which was a novel virus. Is there any vaccine available to prevent HMPV spread? No, there is no vaccine currently, and there is unlikely any need for one as of now. So why are hospitals in China filling up? Is it an outbreak? If not, can it become one in the coming months? In fact, can it snowball into a pandemic just like COVID-19 in the future? What are the safeguards against this virus? What are the medications needed? Is there a need for vaccination in future? And most importantly, while HMPV may not be alarming in itself, is the rising frequency of respiratory diseases a cause for concern? We try to clear the air on all of this in today's episode. It's Thursday, the 9th of January. I'm your host Anirban Chaudhary, and this is the Morning Brief. This episode will be steered by my colleague and ET's pharma leader, Vikas Dandekar. First up, he speaks to Dr. Rajiv Jayadevan, Chairman, Research Cell, Kerala State Indian Medical Association.
Dr. Rajiv Jayadevan, thank you so much for joining us for ET Morning Brief on a very important subject. The virus is back in a different form. HMPV is making headlines, and that's where we would like to have your expertise. So how do you describe this current outbreak? Is there cause for panic? People are actually sending all kinds of signals.
Thank you for having me. And to answer your question straight up, there is no outbreak. All we have are visuals coming out of hospitals in China. At least the label says so. And there are social media users claiming that there is a new virus outbreak there and the hospitals are overwhelmed and there's a global threat. But I'll take you right up to what is happening in China because China is going through winter now. It's located further up north on the globe. So therefore, their winters tend to be more harsh. It's an established fact that in winter, hospitals in China tend to be crowded, really, really crowded. And there are a couple of very interesting reasons for that. If you read the scientific published literature, peer-reviewed published literature about the healthcare system in China, every culture has their own eccentricities. The first peculiarity here is that people in general trust larger hospitals than your friendly neighborhood clinic. And therein starts the second part of the problem. People in China, they like to get an intravenous drip, an IV drip for even the most trivial illnesses. This is particularly true for children. You won't believe it. You would have seen visuals from 2023 about children happily doing their homework while hooked on to IV drips. And so this results in an overcrowding, which should not be there at all. Instead of taking, say, 5 or 10 minutes to process someone who has, say, mild runny nose, this would translate into several hours of staying in the hospital. So if you combine the two, you can imagine where the visuals are coming from now. In China, every winter there is overcrowding in large hospitals, but that does not necessarily mean that there is a new virus out there like COVID. So to put things in simple terms, there is no evidence of any new virus outbreak in China. And these news of so-called detection of HMPV, the first case, etc., as we see in the local media, that does not mean anything at all, because this HMPV is part of our daily life. All of us, while we were children, we all had runny noses. A good number of them would be due to HMPV. But the point is that when a child has a runny nose, doctor is not going to order an expensive test and declare that, hey, you've got HMPV. So what do? You do nothing. You just go home, right? So doctors do not order that. So doctors do a panel of tests. And I believe that is what happened in Bangalore when 2 babies who were admitted with pneumonia were tested. Yes, that's part of standard investigation. That does not necessarily mean that it's the first time it's detected in our country. I think our listeners ought to understand that very clearly.
Dr. Jayadevan, the fact that this has gone across the world and has sent out panic signals, we also read that, it is a relatively stable virus, and most of the children in whom this was detected, almost like in existence for over 2 decades, they were already having antibodies. So can you explain if there is a chance of this becoming like a more potent mutation can come? Because some of the respiratory experts have actually also sent out caution signals regarding pneumonia and bronchitis. So do you think it might spiral in that direction?
No, I'll explain how the epidemiology works. If you take, let's say, 1,000 children with a common cold, maybe around 50 or 60 people would be having HMPV. And if you take 1,000 people with HMPV infection, maybe 999 would simply have a runny nose, and one child might have a bit of asthma and might suffer a worsening of asthma, what we call a trigger, and the child may end up going to the hospital. And if you take 10,000 people with this HMPV, yes, there are children with all sorts of underlying health issues, and maybe 1 or 2 children would have what is called a pneumonia. So out of a very large number of people who have this infection, very small number tend to get sick. And that's the case not only for HMPV, but for every virus, every bacteria known to man. For every pathogen known to man, there are some individuals who take a more severe course, unfortunately. So the point here is we must understand things in perspective. HMPV, like rhinovirus and adenovirus and RSV, or the respiratory syncytial virus, is just a basic common cold virus. And there's no indication that this virus or any of its contemporaries, for example, the RSV or the rhinovirus, have turned more severe in all the decades that it's been known to occur in man. So there is no reason to speculate that suddenly this virus is going to change its genetic nature. And that's an extremely hypothetical position that I would disagree with straight out. Have you ever seen in the past 2 years that HMPV viruses infections have become more severe? No one has ever seen that. So how can you even speculate? If you are speculating based on what you see on your mobile phones, I'm so sorry. If you start trusting seeing what you see on social media, then you're in for a long ride.
Well, it's clear from what Dr. Jayadevan said that more than viruses, the misinformation around them, and more critically, the lack of preparedness to tackle an outbreak, if and when there is one, are much bigger problems. To understand that aspect and how to prepare better, Vikas spoke to Dr. Vinod Skaria, a biologist, medical researcher, and pioneer in the field of precision medicine and clinical genomics in India. In fact, he is best known for sequencing the first Indian genome, in other words, the genetic information of an organism. Here's Vikas and Dr. Skaria.
So, Dr. Skaria, the point is like, what we saw in the previous pandemic, there was a lot of mistrust. Statements were made which actually proved to be wrong from even international health agencies. And so, whenever there is any small surge in such incidences, it actually snowballs. So that again is another extreme. But how do you think we should be prepared for such eventualities? We are seeing like perpetual outbreaks of some or the other virus or infection. We have all these challenges.
So I'll really break this up into three major focus areas. The first being our ability to track outbreaks locally as well as globally. And thanks to renewed interest in outbreaks, there are global organizations tracking outbreaks, but they are not really tracking local outbreaks. For example, the local outbreaks that happen in India. Number two is beyond tracking local outbreaks, we also need to have a molecular diagnosis of what really causes outbreaks. In fact, many of our outbreaks still remain as mystery diseases. The outbreak comes in, people die or people get sick, and after some time, the outbreak dies on its own. Nobody really cares about what really happened. And the third is a surveillance system. A surveillance system is akin to actually putting up a security system. A security system, whether it's a camera or a security personnel, is on a constant watch for threats. And this necessarily means that we need to understand what is really happening at each outbreak in a very unbiased way and actually put it up in a very transparent format. Like, for example, we have a influenza season. Can we really put it up in a very transparent, timely format that everybody else is aware, okay, today this is influenza. I don't need to be worried about it. Or for that matter, it is HMPV. I mean, in fact, this is not the first time HMPV has been identified or diagnosed in India. There has been HMPV diagnosis in the previous past also. But of course, since this is a new virus in many people's mind, at least for non-clinicians, it elicits a sort of curiosity, and of course, the curiosity turns into sometimes misinformation, which can be really catastrophic.
So, Dr. Skaria, from the scientific point of view, we had seen a very robust system evolving via INSACOG when the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 was at the peak. Do you think we need much more of these robust surveillance systems? WHO has actually spoken about ILI and SARI being part of an additional surveillance patterns to study the patterns. Do you think those things also should assume a more permanent form going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the surveillance in a more permanent format should happen in a very decentralized setting. To give examples, in fact, the first genomic surveillance program in India for SARS-CoV-2 was actually initiated by a state government, the government of Kerala, which later was subsumed into INSACOG. And there are also similar statewide programs, for example, in Maharashtra, which is very successful, which ran quite some period of time. And these are examples of how decentralized surveillance systems could be built and can take care of the local requirements. And I think we will need to set up many more such statewide decentralized systems. There's a reason why I'm saying so, because health in India is a state subject. And I think we should really emphasize and re-emphasize on this fact, because the problems in different parts of the country are very different.
Right. In your tweet thread, you actually mentioned about serological studies, which suggested that by age of 5 years, almost every child in Netherlands had been exposed to the human metapneumovirus. So coming back to the point of the current incidences that we are seeing, you are sure about this prevalence being pretty wide even in India, right?
Yeah, so in fact, if you ask people who have been in the field of infectious diseases, they would tell that human metapneumovirus has been diagnosed in the past quite many periods of time. The only challenge that has been, and why people don't really know about this virus, is there's no widely available, affordable diagnostic tools for HMPV. And in fact, today, only one of the approved diagnostics, which is a panel of infectious disease tests, what we call as a film array, is what diagnoses HMPV. So only very few laboratories and very few hospitals have access to this. And of course, this test is a bit expensive. But assume that we had much better and affordable diagnostic RT-PCR reagents, I'm sure this viruses would have been diagnosed much better, much earlier, and probably would have alleviated the fear in the minds of.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly where we keep coming back to the topic of how it is important to have low cost diagnostic tools and kits so that we can quickly detect and nip the problem in the bud. As a virus spreads in the previous thing that we had seen 3-4 years, there was a constant evolution and mutation. You don't see that as a problem in this particular situation, right?
So it is very well known that RNA viruses can mutate much faster than DNA viruses. And HMPV, apart from many other RNA viruses, including the SARS-CoV-2 that we have seen in the pandemic, can mutate quite very fast compared to other DNA viruses. But having said that, the mutations are part of the evolutionary process of a virus. And in fact, viruses keep mutating all the time. Now, what we need to really keep track about is, one, is the virus mutating to cause more severity of the disease? Number two, is the severity of the disease predictable because of the mutation? And both of these are interrelated to each other. And the only way to me to be able to understand this at much great depth is to be able to sequence viruses at scale. I'm not saying that we need to sequence all HMPV viruses, but at least as part of a surveillance program during the seasonal outbreaks, be able to sequence representative samples and make this data publicly available. Because what's really important is this data could drive the generation of diagnostics and the deployment of diagnostics in a very fast and affordable format. And I think that is really where our pandemic preparedness would really impact humankind.
And so, what about the other aspect of preparedness? Vaccines. To understand that, Vikas spoke to Dr. Rachis Ella, Chief Development Officer at Bharat Biotech. Here's Dr. Ella.
There's two kinds of vaccine manufacturers, at least in the developing world. There's a vaccine developer and there's a vaccine manufacturer. There's a stark difference between both, where a vaccine developer needs to work on novel molecules and do their best effort to commercialize them, whereby a vaccine manufacturer usually in-licenses technology and then commercializes products. And at Bharat, we're a firm believer that Global South diseases require Global South solutions. And from a scientific standpoint, curiosity, we've understood the HMPV's genetic evolution and have already narrowed in on a few vaccine candidates using several manufacturing platforms.
Now, given the situation that has been emerging over the last 4 or 5 years, we have actually seen a series of potential outbreaks. Thankfully, they have remained within control. Mpox was one. We've seen occasional emergence of avian flu and many others. So, how, as a vaccine producer, do you think such situations can be handled better? Is there something that we can actually look at in terms of some kind of a more permanent solution to this?
Absolutely. So I think what I would advocate for is a multi-stakeholder approach here. This would definitely involve vaccine developers and manufacturers, but also integral key members here are governments, healthcare providers, and also supranational organizations. For example, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, or several other health regulatory agencies. So once you're having this integrated approach, then there needs to be a call to action towards ensuring that countries are self-reliant in terms of identifying pathogens fairly swiftly. For that, you need to have strong surveillance networks. And then once you identify pathogens within the country, then deciding the right method of combating the pathogen. It could be through biologic therapeutics. And then there's also another approach where you can use a preventive approach or a prophylactic approach where you generate a vaccine to prevent the disease. And in this case, I think vaccine manufacturers at least have heightened awareness and alertness when it comes to these outbreaks. The pandemic has taught us one key fundamental strategy is to be platform agnostic. So I think it's very important for us to have a diversified platform strategy so that when we are hit with such outbreaks or pandemics, these manufacturers, these developers are then able to plug and play from their basket the wide array of platforms that work for some viruses and does not work for some viruses.
So, Dr. Ella, say for example, this time we are seeing a lot of caution being advised, and the situation in China probably will not really blow up the way it happened 4 years, 5 years ago. But in a situation of a similar nature, if that again happens, how do you think we will be having the guardrails in place so that, again, we don't see the massive emergencies coming in? The question is that lessons from the pandemic, has it really made us better equipped?
No, absolutely. I think I'm taking the pandemic as our example. I'm also taking the H1N1 outbreak as an example, where Indian vaccine manufacturers and also global vaccine manufacturers were able to develop vaccines in record time. I think those rapid response models have been established, and we are working as a community. So there is a 100-day mission by various governments and various supranational organizations to try to bring down what was a 9-month to 12-month COVID-19 vaccine developmental process to 100 days. It's a very ambitious project, but we definitely think it is a probable and plausible target to achieve as well. There is some universal vaccine technologies for flu and COVID that's being studied. When it comes to novel outbreaks as well, we are trying to refine what that 100 days could look like and what are the platforms that will actually work here. That's something that's being studied. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of funding as well for product developers and academic scientists and also regulators to ensure that we reach some kind of global consensus on what that regulatory strategy needs to be. So I do see it as an achievable target. The question is when, and I think we should have an answer in a year or two with regards to the exact framework and how we can align globally.
That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. We hope you are better informed about the HMPV virus, the various ways in which the current situation can pan out, and how to deal with those after listening to this episode. It was produced by Vinay Joshi and sound designed by Indranil Bhattacharjee. Please like, share, and subscribe to The Morning Brief, which drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Thank you, and have a good remainder of the week. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.